Hi, man.
Hey, good morning.
Good morning. How are you?
Good evening.
Good evening.
I thought I was all organized and suddenly I'm scrambling a bit, so hang on.
Yeah, is there some conflicts in time with you guys?
No, I had another meeting and decided I had enough time to make a coffee, and then my computer decided to act up as I was joining this.
No problem.
I'll be 1 second.
Yeah, we have some delay in the people joining, or if a lot of people decide not to join today, we at least have the recording. So
Okay.
yeah. I'm at least very curious, and then I'll join us as well.
Well, it'll be pretty informal if it's just us, but that's cool.
We're trying to keep this quite informal. We've been at max 13 to 15 people. So we're trying to make a very conversation based. All these meetings started initially with me going through the basics, and then we kind of gradually gone through the basics, and now gotten to a level where we need to introduce more experts on certain areas, like yourself. And this is for the Nordic community, because we are already quite far advanced on digital identity, but being advanced also means that we can fall behind, right?
Yep.
So that's a big issue. So yeah, I think we can just begin, and then the people who will do it later can just kind of catch up on the recording afterwards.
Well, I put a handful of slides together just to get the conversation started, but as you said, and we talked about, I'm assuming this is going to be very informal, so I will just share my screen.
Yes, please go ahead.
And we'll go from there. Okay, introduction to org book.
Nice.
So basically want to talk about a bit of the background of org book and how we got here, what it's evolved to, which is kind of weird, and some of it quite separate from the world of verifiable credentials and so on. So I'll talk about that, but some other things we're doing in relation to org book.
Yeah.
So at the beginning, what we talked about, so John Jordan and I, John is the BC Gov guy that's driving a lot of this. We had this vision. He had worked at Corporations Canada, so the government of Canada come out to British Columbia because of the identity program and the capabilities, digital identity that was there, and wanted to continue to expand on it. And the idea we had was the business owner, Mary, being able to accomplish all the things she needed to do to license her company, to make sure it was following all the regulations and so on. And that often is a big journey because you're dealing with multiple levels of government, municipal government, regional governments, provincial governments, federal governments, and so on. And so they're all sort of acting as silos. And we sort of drew out this whole picture of how Mary could have a wallet, and her company could get its credentials from each one, and then as it went to each new place in her journey to be able to open her business, she would be able to present the credentials from the previous levels of bureaucracy and present it to the next one, and they would be able to verify her data and give her their credential, and she could move on, and it would make her journey much easier. In government speak, that's called what's called one stop or something like that is the common name for it. In Canada, there's another one called BizPal, but basically it's governments that are trying to make it easy for businesses to get started and get through all the red tape, but it never seems to be able to be accomplished because all of the government organizations are all kind of siloed, and they can't afford to, combined together into a single entity, because every journey is totally different. If the business is on one street that's in one municipality and another business is 2 streets over, it's going to be a totally different journey. So that was kind of the vision. We would use verifiable credentials, which we were just learning about and using. So we were really cool with that. We did decide to start with public data, not private, so that if we kind of screwed it up, it wouldn't matter. So that's where the idea of starting with organizations rather than starting with people would be useful, because if we screwed up with people, their private data would be out. Organizational data is public by definition. You put it up on walls and things. The vision that I just gave of, Mary and her organization having a wallet, proving credentials and getting credentials and being able to start her, get all the regulatory compliance items out of the way, just sitting at her desktop. But then we got into the chicken and egg problem. None of the organizations that offer credentials or that you are required to get permits and licenses, they don't give verifiable credentials, and no businesses have wallets. So we didn't quite know how to proceed. And then we had a little epiphany that we could do, which is, since it's all public data, we could use a bootstrapping technique, which is what became Orgbook BC. So the idea of it is, rather than waiting for Mary and Bob and every other business owner to have their own wallet and then start issuing credentials into those, we would have a community wallet that is just a public repo of credentials, since it's all public data anyway. And we could learn about verifiable credentials. We could enable the issuers like BC Registries and Health to issue credentials. And we could probably provide a service for it, because we could show people, but more it was to experiment and learn. And so that's what we built. So Orgbook is a repository of public information about registered organizations. It contains, we started with BC Registries data. So BC Registries, just to be clear, is the thing that provides the birth certificate for any company or registered entity in British Columbia. So you can't have a business without getting a BC Registries registration. And they also, and then we made it so that additional data could be added to it from additional authorized issuers. And we had this vision that, governments are in the business of issuing permits. So every permit and license issuer in BC could issue to the Orgbook. So that was the idea. It would be a website. And that's kind of interesting, because BC did not have a public website with registries data in it. And so as a result, this actually turned out to be a thing in and of itself, separate from verifiable credentials.
Yeah.
An open API for reading and getting notifications about companies, and I'll talk a bit about that. And then a publishing API for authorities to issue data into the Orgbook, which comes back to this idea that every permit licensor and registry would issue credentials into it.
Can I just ask a kind of background question, like how digitized were these governments and institutions from before? Like, did they have anything from before? Because in Norway, we have, as a sent per email, we have this Brønnøysundregisteret, which is like which being run by this governmental organization, which gets their money from the tax government, and trying to kind of drive forward digitization in the governmental aspect.
I looked at the website, and pretty much what BC has is very similar, in that you can go online and register your company and do a name search to make sure that the name is not being used. You're not stepping on somebody else's name, and you can get registered. So that, and I noticed in that you can also search for credentials or search for businesses and things like that. The searching capability was not there. So this now, Orgbook is now BC's way of how you search for companies. BC just didn't have one, and which is kind of weird when I look around. So the website is really just exactly the same as what almost every other jurisdiction does in the world. This is the state of Delaware. This is the UK. The one you showed me was, a Nordic country one. They all have one. BC didn't, which was weird. So it turned out we weren't just playing around in verifiable credentials and learning about them, but we actually were creating something that the province needed.
Yeah.
Just didn't have. When I look at other ones, I've had to do some work. I work with Sovereign Foundation, and I had to do some work looking up companies. And it turned out that, these other ones, this is the state of Delaware, I just happened to click on. But and if you don't know, Delaware is the place in the United States where almost every company is registered. For
never heard about it.
Certain legal reasons, I gather they have certain laws that make it friendly for companies. But the website had very useful features because, like, we had a web page for every company, so that there was a unique URL for every company and things like that. It allowed you to send a URL and email and arrive at it, whereas the state of Delaware, UK, most of the other ones you can't do that. So there's certain good things about it, but that's just detail. API. So the API is completely open. And so what that allows is now when an organization has to apply for a credential at some other website, a permit, a license, whatever, they have to enter the name of the company. Previously, it's always done with typing in the name of the company, and then the person receiving the data has to verify it and do a bunch of checking. So the API allows them to guarantee they get the right name, the right legal name of the company, and various other identifiers for the company, like their tax number and things like that. So that just makes it easier for places that have to collect that information to do it. They can just call the API. It's a couple hours work by a front end developer, and they get reliable data instead of having to verify the data after it's entered. There's some good stories about how we dealt with that, or how companies discovered things about their clients, or how permitting organizations discovered things about their clients that are kind of interesting. But that's an add-on. Subscribing to changes in the organization. Again, I don't think this is a particularly unknown feature with registries, but you can, if you issue a permit to one company, you might want to be able to follow along to find out if anything changes, if they get dissolved, if they merge into another company, or something else happens, they change their name. You can subscribe to notifications and then decide to act. So again, this is just sort of trying to close the loopholes in government where companies were taking advantage of breaks between paper processes. A company would dissolve, and another organization that had issued a permit would never hear about it.
Yeah.
Things like that. Again, nothing to do really with verified credentials. So I'll skip over this as well. Publishing credentials to the org book. This is a little more to do with credentials, which is that any organization, as long as they collected the data and had the the proper names and identifiers for the company, could issue a credential, and that goes into org book. So we created a way that issuers could do that, and the vision there was that even a town in northern BC, which is extraordinarily sparsely populated, that has a city clerk that keeps everything in a Excel spreadsheet. We envisioned that she would just be able to submit her spreadsheet, and we'd have an interface that allowed those to be turned into org book licenses. We haven't got anywhere close to that far, but that was kind of the vision, is enabling org book to be used, to get a full view of the economy, to be able to see all of the credentials being issued. We're not anywhere close to that, but we're making baby steps on it.
It's still being developed on a regular basis, right?
Yeah, and the key there was that it's just a valuable product on its own, a product in and of itself. So we're getting more users on a continuous basis. We've actually got a project to help with the better UX. More issuers are coming on board. So in BC, actually, I'll talk a bit about it at the end, but mining and extracting resources from the land, that becomes an important permitting. That is a very important permitting and regulatory issue in British Columbia. So we're doing things around credentials and that, and I'll talk a bit about that. And then as part of what we're doing with in BC with Akapai and multi-tenant, now that we've got a multi-tenant capability, rather than every issuer having to spin up and do all the work of spinning up an agent and an issuer agent and being able to do that, we can actually implement a service so that any government organization can join the service and get their own wallet basically and start issuing credentials. A big goal here is to enable the services to be able to issue credentials, not just to the org book, but actually in general. And in doing that, they have to think through, what is a credential to their clients? What is the life cycle of a credential? When do they revoke it and go through that? And then they build that business logic into their software, even though they're just issuing to org book. And that's going to enable it for once they start issuing to organizations.
Yeah.
So as far as additional directions, org book is BC is a product in itself. We've packaged up and made everything open source, so any jurisdiction can start their own org book. We started with Ontario doing it with us, and they built their own, and that made sure we were being agnostic to the BC situation. They had different scenarios they needed support, and it made sure we did things in sort of a not tied to a specific implementation. We made very conscious decisions about being agnostic to what the credentials looked like, what the format was, how the issuer could express to the org book what was meant by the data in the credential and things like that.
Yeah.
Underlying, and this gets a bit to the questions we've been having in our online chat, which is underlying org book is Aries VCR, which is a layer of abstraction beyond the registry's use case. So org book BC is specifically tied to registries. The main entity that the credentials are about are companies or registered organizations. And so that's a specific use case of Aries VCR, which is a verifiable credential repository. So it's a thing that can take any type of credential to it, can make a credential a top level entity within that within that instance, and then receive credentials associated with that, whatever that entity is.
That's interesting. So it's like, how do you then? So that has to be like a trusted repository, right? And then everyone just is it up to each entity to accept to send credentials to this repository, or is it then the issuer sends it directly to this repository?
So that's where it gets interesting as to how you would use it. One of the use cases we thought early on was what we refer to as traversing the web of trust, which is how does the verifier trust an issuer? The first answer to that is if the verifier's never heard of the issuer. So the classic example for me is an employer gets from a student a verifiable credential that they graduated, and they can look at the credential, they can do the cryptography, and they can trust the student, the applicant that the credential is cryptographically correct, right?
Hmm.
They know it was issued to them. It hasn't been tampered with. They can tell the did, at least, of the issuer. And if it's got revocation associated, they can check to see if it's been revoked. But then they have to decide, do they trust the issuer? And so they have to do, if they've never heard of the issuer, they get a did they don't recognize, they have to go do some work. They have to figure out, do I trust this issuer? The first way to do it is you just ask the issuer, what's your authority to issue credentials? And there's no real standard way of doing that. I think that is the next thing that's coming. And that's something we've been thinking, right from the beginning of how you go about doing that. But the idea would be, you're a university, under what authority do you issue diplomas? And then you get an answer back that's saying, oh, well, we've got this thing from British Columbia that says we're a secondary institution and we're allowed to give diplomas out, and the employer goes, oh, okay, British Columbia, I'm in Vancouver and I know who British Columbia is, so I'm going to trust that. Well, then you get one from a university in Denmark that you actually haven't heard of, and you're not sure who the authority is in Denmark, and so on. So now you go up and ask that verifier, okay, hey, authority, how are, who made you authority over universities, and so on. So traversing is really like doing a CA scan, except that you could have any sort of hierarchy. It's a mesh as opposed to a pure hierarchy. So one of the things we envision is that a VCR could be a trusted VCR could be a way to do that. So a government could operate a thing that says any credential coming from BC Gov will have an entry in this credential registry that says who they are and under what authority they issue credentials. So instead of having to go back to the issuer and climb the hierarchy, you can sort of bypass it and go directly to a VCR. So that's kind of a vision for it, but it's never been used in that way. So I caveat with, we designed it so that it's very generic, but it's never been used in that way. But that's how we sort of see it, that you don't always, for a ecosystem, for a governance infrastructure, you might have a central repository of authorities that say, okay, here's credentials about a set of DIDs that give you information about issuers.
Yeah.
So envision, the problem IATA's got right now, which is every country has to provide a list of who can issue, COVID-19 vaccination credentials.
Yeah.
So what you could do is you could have an ARIES VCR and only allow countries to issue credentials to it, and the credentials they issue are the list of issuers.
Yeah.
And so that's kind of the idea we had with that. Does that make sense?
That makes a lot of sense. It's like the trust has to come from somewhere.
Yeah.
And if you can crowdsource a trust like this, like, okay, but who would be the hosting part of this VCR? Would it be more we don't have to go to the decentralized of it, but it's just that question just pops in as a
absolutely. And that's one of the things. I actually have an article called Traversing the Web of Trust that I wrote in 2018 that talks about all this. And one of the things it talks about is bypassing it and having, a verifier might trust their vendor to keep a allow list of issuers that they should trust. And that's the service provided by the vendor of, the person providing the verifier software.
Yeah.
So they might keep that for them. There's all sorts of ways that this could happen. ARIES VCR is a repository of credentials. So it just understands and allows you to receive credentials. And as I say, we really built it just to experiment so that we could do our whole picture. without it. But it is a possible use of it, and we've made sure that we've done everything in the open. And whenever we've changed things, we've tried to make it so that it still fits that vision.
Yeah.
Whether it ever actually happens, we'll see. But it's certainly an option.
Interesting.
The other direction we're taking is really to go back to that original vision of organizations and getting credentials from BC registries about companies into the hands of the companies themselves. And so that's really the next wave of what we're doing. So the idea would be, if 68%, I think, are single proprietor owner companies in British Columbia. So ownership of a company could be given to the owner, a credential saying they own this company could be issued by BC registries into a personal wallet. And then we've long had this vision of organizational wallets. And I actually got to see a demo yesterday that where another group within BC Gov, I was just really excited about it, but another group within BC Gov is demonstrating how to do an organizational wallet where, as I say, the wallet is literally owned by the organization, and they there's software related to it that allows them to receive credentials, to receive proof requests, to issue credentials, and to issue proofs against a proof request. And these would be credentials about the organization itself, which is super interesting, because then the organization can do things like, as I say, prove things about themselves, that they're a registered company in British Columbia, that they've got a permit to mine in British Columbia. And they can also do things like issue credentials to the people that work for the company to delegate authority, so that people can go to the bank and say, well, I represent this company, here's proof. And then the bank can ping back to the online organizational wallet that, it's an enterprise app, and it can receive a proof request from the bank and provide a proof back and things like that. So,
and I guess you would have like a two-way off there, where you say, okay, these 5 people in this organization is allowed to do take actions based on the organizational wallet.
Absolutely. Yep. That's exactly right. We actually kind of thought of it as the credentials themselves are a set of resources. The people then would have access to different ones. So you've got sort of a Active Directory type thing, but you're using verifiable credentials as the auth. So you issue a credential to the person so they can access the repository of credentials and things like that. The person might have qualifications. So within the mining permit, you might have an inspector who's got to be a professional engineer and got to have their personal credentials for the work that they do. And then they can associate with that, I work for this company, or I've got delegated responsibility from this company, and I'm a professional engineer, and therefore I'm allowed to do this inspection, for example, of a mine or something like that. Yeah, it really expands out. Business banking initiative is a project we're actually working on right now. It's sort of a background task of across Canada. So basically, a bunch of registries in Canada issues verifiable credentials about organizations, and those organizations can take those credentials to a bunch of banks that are also working on this initiative and use those credentials to open a business account online. So that's the use case, basically, and BC and Alberta and the government of Canada and a whole bunch of banks in Canada are involved in this initiative to experiment with how this would all work. But it's fundamentally flawed in that we're currently only issuing the credentials to personal wallets. We're putting them in, Trinsic wallets and things like that. That really limits the use case to, single owner companies basically, or ones where you can issue the credentials to the people that are associated with the company. What we're realizing the next step really is that registries would issue, exactly that scenario I talked about earlier. Registries issuing to organizational wallets, and then the person is really coordinating between registries and the organizational wallets, and then coordinating between the bank and the organizational wallets.
And when you say wallets, you have kind of deliberately used wallet instead of agent, or what's your thoughts on that?
Yes, and the reason for that is that in my mind, so wallets in the mainstream are really, Google Wallet, Apple Wallet. They're the place you hold your credentials.
Yeah.
An organizational wallet is the equivalent. So while you can have an agent that is a verifier and another, that's an issuer where you're handing out stuff based on the business that you're in, an organizational wallet is really holds the credentials of the organization itself. That it's, as I say, that it's a registered entity, that it's got a permit to do mining, that it has that it's listed on the New York Stock Exchange, blah, 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 whatever credentials about the organization itself. And that's where I ever use the term wallet. It's really a holder, the holder prover.
Yeah. Interesting.
The big thing we're doing in British Columbia, I mentioned this a few times, of using the example of the mining permits. A big thing we want to be able to do is give organizations in British Columbia that are in sourcing of raw materials credentials to show the mitigation efforts they're taking to do sustainable extraction of raw materials, or as much as it can be. Things like how much GHG emissions are they producing in extracting stuff out of the ground, so that when companies that want to know these things need to know what is the sustainability, what is the environmental impact, the term is ESG, impact of the supply chain, that a BC company can produce all the credentials necessary to show that it is following guidelines, it has gone through a review process, and all of the other regulatory requirements that have to happen in British Columbia, with the idea that as that becomes more important in the world, BC companies will have an advantage, because they'll be able to prove all of these things easily without onerous regulatory efforts, without paper. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
I imagine that would be a big deal where you are.
Yeah, like you could, if everyone had, if every database existed with an API and had good authentication mechanisms, like this wouldn't be necessary, right? But again, you want to get there, because there's a better model than having everyone serving up APIs. Because here in Norway, I can log in with this thing called Bank ID.
Yeah.
And through the B-Reg that I showed you, I'm connected to 3, 4, 5 different companies, and I can go into this portal as company X.
Yeah. Okay.
So there's happened a lot of like amazing digital work on it, but it doesn't open up for a lot of innovation, because it's happening on the side where the government has to put a lot of money on it, and they're putting a lot of efforts, and they're hiring a lot of consultants. They're one of the biggest purchasers of consultants, because they're not able to hire enough IT staff to kind of build this out.
Yeah.
But I just so we've gotten really far in the digitization space, but we're still depending on that one authorization mechanism and that one API to be working, to be able to kind of go forward.
I mean, that's the big thing we see is that we can't scale the idea that everyone's going to log in. Everyone's going to log into all the systems. Like, so example is in BC, we have digital ID, pretty advanced digital ID. You can get a mobile services card. And so a services card is equivalent to our driver's license.
Yeah.
You can get a version of that on your phone. Don't know where my phone is. Weird. And use that. But the effort to integrate, and it's not using a verifiable credential. It's using a traditional, basically the mobile app is giving consent, and then the data passes from the BC government to whoever is the relying party. So it's probably an OpenID Connect model. The problem with that is that it's 6 months to a year for every entity that wants to integrate into that. They have to write thousands of documents to get approval. They have to do all of the, because the government's not just going to give anyone access to their core database.
No.
So what we want is to allow the economy to continue to operate in more or less silos, but to give the citizen the credentials they need so they can use them wherever they want, just like they use the piece of paper they have wherever they want. And that's basically the model, because we don't think this integration model between every party is scales.
No, it doesn't scale unless you have the money of somehow able to help everyone build a system that integrates with everyone. But in the end, you're not gonna be able to do that. But okay, Norway, we have how much? 11 trillion NOK in a or billion, whatever, in this fund of oil, and so there's money that can be pushed into the government to build this digitization to make the world better for us Norwegians. But can't we just enable the community, enable the people in the country instead of having to just wait for the government to build out what they need to build out?
Yeah, that's exactly what we're aiming for in this. So different use cases, but they're all centered around providing a way that that people can use their data, and organizations can use their data in ways that are up to them, without being constrained by, but doing it in ways that enable privacy and so on, which is why we come back to things like verifiable credentials, being able to do selective disclosure and all of those things.
Yeah. Have you guys gotten a question around business model and how, when you're democratizing these credentials, there's potentially businesses going out because they've been working at that central database that was trustworthy and that you had to try to read from.
Yeah.
So have you guys been in touch or discussed that aspect, or is it still kind of?
It's interesting. So there's a couple of things with business models. One is the pain of the business model of the wallet. We don't want, the classic example. Hey, it looks like you've just presented your credential to a police officer. Would you like a lawyer? We'll contact one for you. So we don't want, obviously, the exploitation economy based in a wallet. So that's a huge one, and we're trying to figure out that. We're probably going to do a pretty big open source effort on a wallet and come up with, conformance criteria for wallets and try to express to citizens what's safe and what's not. But that's one. Interestingly, a bunch of the data in org book is in the legislation that registries must charge people for it. So we can't put everything into the org book as a public source because registries is required to charge people to use it, which is just a clawback. You must self-fund your government organization. I think that's just kind of an anomaly. No, I think the big thing is enabling the economy, is making the digital economy work and making it safe. So those are the main factors. And then, are you familiar with the term ESG?
Please explain.
Environmental, social, and governance, and basically it's the idea that the simple example I like to use is cigarette companies were following regulations and doing all they, following the rules, but they knew they were, essentially killing people, and eventually that liability caught up with them. So even though they were following the rules, they were building up a huge liability. Well, ESG basically says that investors want to know what liability a company is building up in its practices, in its internal practices. And so, in particularly in, BC is very much a land-based, raw materials-based economy. And so that's a huge thing, is being, that use case I gave of is non-trivial at all. If you're going to invest in a mine, if you're going to put, $1 billion into building a mine, you do not want to find out that, the tailings pond is going to collapse and you're going to kill 1,000 people and so on and so forth, or you're just tromping over the indigenous people on the land, and eventually that's going to catch up with you. So ESG is becoming a huge issue, not just in what companies are doing after they start to extract materials, but in investments and things like that. If a company is looking to invest in that, they're going to look at places around the world, and they're going to want to go to a place where they know that the practices are good and solid, and that's provable. So again, that's a big driver, which is why I mentioned the resource sector a few times. That's been a motivator a bunch.
So how is credentials linked to ESG, or what's the
as I say, it's, if an investor is talking to a company and they want to find out, what standards they follow in doing their mining, in what permits they've had done, what are their compliance reports from government, all of that information, they can provide it to them, but it all comes in the form of paper, and then they have to do due diligence to see, do they actually trust it, and so on. If they're and it's coming self-attested, basically. If it's coming from authorities, then it carries weight, and it's trivial to process.
It's a much better way to move data around.
Exactly. Yeah,
that's cool. Do you want to kind of quickly go into how Aries is part of this BC Gov?
Yeah. So in building Orgbook, as I said, it now, when we look at it now, if we'd started from scratch with the vision of what it is now, we never would have looked at verifiable credentials. We just would have done APIs and stuff like this. But our whole purpose was to learn about verifiable credentials and enable companies, organizations to issue it. So as a result, we started with, basically the Indy SDK at the beginning, and that's about it. And so we built up an entire agent, Indy agent, from that. And then we threw all that away and created Aries Cloud Agent Python as the underlying piece of that. And we largely used Orgbook as our environmental, or sorry, our use case and deployment model. We built up a whole bunch of other things along the way, but the core of it was Aries Cloud Agent Python, which was an open source agent that could be used in sort of any enterprise use case. And so anything you see we've done, like we did a bounty and produced a thing for, or what we call a Code With Us, a grant to a company for an OpenID Connect verifier. So the verifier is just an IDP, an identity provider, and it talks to an application like a relying party does to any other IDP, like logging with Facebook. But the collection of the credentials is done through a wallet, through verifiable credentials. That was just built on top of Akapai. So we built a whole pile of things by continuing to expand on what Akapai could do, following helping to drive the standards, the protocols, and then implementing those and experimenting with them in Aries Cloud Agent. And so that's how we got to where we're both driving a whole bunch of use cases within BC government, but also driving the standards and the capabilities within Aries agents. That was the model.
That's interesting. Did you guys give everyone their own agent, or was it like a centralized agent for just?
Right now, we're generally the split is we operate the Aries Cloud Agent piece, and they operate the controller that has the business logic. And as I say, now that we've got multi-tenant, which we didn't come up with and somebody else implemented, but now that we've got it, we're building up a service where we provide. So it now looks like it's kind of going to be the service itself. You still have to do the business logic on their side, but they're just talking to APIs then if they're internal clients. And so again, allows us to expand with lesser impact on the business software. Yeah. Hopefully that makes sense. But
that's interesting. In terms of like when you guys started, there was no other agents or actors, I guess. So
there really was not a whole lot. There was Evernym and Sovereign, and we did a whole pile of stuff with them. And as we built some of these things out, had some core things done in Indie SDK. We, the Postgres, we did a code with us, and the guy who did the Postgres we brought onto our team. So it's proved a bit of a pipeline for us, but yeah, there wasn't that much out there. So we were really learning from scratch. It's an interesting government model, I gotta say.
That's good. Well, what's your thoughts on like now you kind of see Ramo popping up and Spruce popping up and all these other like, how do you think things align at some point?
I think, okay, so a couple of things. One is, I could have done, when I first saw the Veramo, if I have the pronunciation right, presentation, I could have replaced the title with Akapai, and all of the architectural diagrams and all of those applied. So we were like, oh, that is so cool. What we're trying to do, I don't know if you've seen our Aries Interop info. What we're trying to do is bring them into just align with the Aries protocols, keep implementing what you're doing. That's cool. But align with the protocols. And then the other side is the VC. We really think BBS Plus and JSON LD, that work that we're doing right now, and a DID resolver that will resolve to multiple DID ledgers, that work that SICPA is doing right now, those things are going to make it bring the alignment together. Yeah. Have you guys seen? Have you seen the Aries Interop info?
You can share it if you want. I think I've seen it, but I don't know if the rest of the guys have seen it, or the recording for that matter.
We're super excited about this. I'll just show this quickly.
We actually have Jonas here. He's a student at the NTNU, one of the most technical university of Norway, and he's writing a bachelor thesis on Interop in itself.
Well, here, you need this. So this is showing a set of Aries frameworks. Ours, the one we drove, the .NET, JavaScript, and Go. And then these are a series of interoperability tests, and you show showing how many are being executed by each combination of agents and how many are passing. You can drill into each one to see a bit more details about basically what each test spins up a Docker container that can use any of the frameworks, any of the test agents. So the test agent is the framework wrapped into a container with an interface on it. And so the test can drive them. And so each test has the pieces to it. And then let me click on this one. And then behind that are all of the details about what tests are being executed. So these are basically this has all the reporting of what are the set of tests that are being executed on each one, what's passing, what's failing. And then you can go to an overview and see the trends over the last few, 20 runs of it to see what's passing, what's failing, and what's not. And then, of course, you can drill into all of these to see the results. The big thing for us is this gets you really can see exactly who's got stuff working, who doesn't, how much, what tests are working, and so on. So we think this is going to be really important for driving interoperability. What we're encouraging Consensus to do is add Veramo to this, get them include theirs, and see how the interactions go.
Should we begin with then renaming it from Aries Interop into interop.info?
We'll see. We'll see. Another cool thing that actually came out in the yesterday, I ran through the big chunk of it, but we actually made a way those are all running containers, and you just run a command line that says, oh, I want to run the .NET agent as Acme, and I want to run the Akapai as Bob, and I want to run this one as Faber, and it just runs the tests. And because of the way they're structured, anyone can play any role. One of our team members built a mobile mechanism, mobile back channel for this, so that you can it actually through the terminal pops up QR codes that a mobile agent can use to actually execute all of the tests. And we ran all the tests through Trinsic, and we're able to see how many of them they could pass and so on. So this could become, even for an agent going into a wallet going into an app store, you can run this same compatibility interoperability suite and be able to just see how it works. We're really excited about that because we think that's going to be a huge piece of it as we build out open source wallets and stuff.
Yeah, no, I think that interoperability has had focus, but it doesn't get that much an engineering focus necessarily. But this is a really good step in the right direction. I just hope that, I don't know, people might be scared of oh, it's the Aries world, I can honestly say that I'm scared of the sovereign network Hyperledger. I want to be on Ethereum or somewhere else, but and I know Aries is going to be agnostic at some point, but that just has had me stop to go to the Aries community for a long while until I kind of now I just have to get something that kind of is working well.
Yeah.
And went to the Aries community.
That's a super interesting thing because all of these things we're talking about, this stuff has been working in Indy for 4 years.
Yeah.
Revocations, zero-knowledge proofs, predicates, all these things, but not in a standard way. And there was this perception that it's all, and Evernym has managed to make it themselves isolated and away from the rest of the community, and to some extent, we can't get them to build an Aries back channel. For a long time, their stuff didn't work with our stuff. So it's been kind of frustrating, and we hope this thing will bring it together. But we really hope it also brings in, and especially when we add did resolution across multiple ledgers and BBS Plus, where you don't need all of the other ledger objects that Indy brings into the game and non-creds brings into it. It'll bring that interoperability together. That's what we're counting.
Yeah, in terms of who would you say is the best expert on BBS Plus these days? Except for Matter, of course, or Matter cannot.
Yeah. I mean, obviously, Matter. I was about to say, Secure Key has done a whole pile of stuff in the Aries framework Go.
Yeah.
And that's what we're building off of. So Animo, do you know Animo? Timo?
Yeah.
Yeah, awesome. So his team, Karim and Timo and team in the Netherlands are doing the Occupy work for us. So we did a bounty and posting, and they won it, and so they're implementing it. So they're going to be very strong in being able to do it. But the implementation in AF-Go, in Aries Framework Go, is really useful to use for moving forward. So looking at that is a good idea.
Yeah. And how would let's call it backwards compatibility with the existing credentials issued in the Aries Python work with BBS for the future? How would that
Our anticipation is we'll support both anon-creds, JSON LD, LD signatures, as well as BBS Plus, and kind of negotiate as you go which one you use. That's the vision. And then the idea, my expectation is we'll deprecate one, the other, or go forward with the one that carries the weight. We're not sure who that will be yet. So that's why the version 2 of the Aries credential exchange protocols are so important, because they allow negotiation as you begin to issue a credential, or as you do a proof. We think we've done presentation exchange. We've got a developer that's done the diff presentation exchange in Occupy, so that'll be available soon. We'll see whether we actually migrate. I can see it possible that we would migrate the Indy proof request into the diff format, and so that we can use that for even Indy anon-creds credentials. We'll see, proofs, I mean. So we'll see how that's to be determined a bit, but I certainly see that we want to be able to provide support for both.
Yeah, that's super interesting. It's such a young space, right? And it's so much happening at the same time, but everyone wants to converge.
Yeah.
But on what and where, it's a big question. But then these efforts are really good to kind of get there, though.
Yeah. Everyone has their, everyone's got to figure out how they move forward with their own constraints. That's a big part. And interoperability isn't always a constraint. Like Evernym is just full on. We just want to implement as many things as we can, and hope we win the day. I think that's basically, and we're much more wanting to find a path of being able to implement and lead with code. At the same time, watching and going in the direction that we think is important. And we believe ZKP and selective disclosure. I shouldn't say that. BC Gov believes ZKP and selective disclosure are really, really crucial. And as a result, all of the things that came before BBS Plus in the JSON LD sort of sphere wasn't particularly useful, because when you proved the credential, you proved everything, and you had a unique identifier for the person. Those two things are kind of like, whoa, that's not going to work. So that's why, anon-creds kept being the one we would go to, because we had those capabilities, and why BBS Plus suddenly becomes the potential to align is because it's got those crucial features that you need.
Yeah.
So
that's really interesting. Like we're kind of going to end here, so let's just kind of say really great thanks for coming and showcasing this. It was really helpful or learnful. Or my English really struggles now, but
it's late at night.
Learning for me at least, and I'm not going to speak for the rest of the guys, but we can, if you have time, we can take a couple of questions. But I just want to wrap it up so the stream will cut.
I'm going to have to go pretty soon. I got another meeting starting now.
Okay, yeah, that's okay. We can I can sit down and discuss with the guys afterwards. So that's completely fine.
It was fun. Appreciate it.
But really, thanks for showing up and talking to us. And
thanks, definitely.
Here on some events.
All right. See you, folks.
So, what do you guys think?
Yeah, nice to see that there is some progress of implementing verifiable credentials in British Columbia. Like, nice to hear that there's some progress in adoption and so on. Yeah.
Yeah.
But for interoperability, they are like there is a work ongoing only specifically to areas framework. Yeah, but like between these areas frameworks, but not much happening between areas and other.
I think that like that's where areas want to go, and they've done good work in starting with themselves because they have areas go.net and everyone. So that they kind of, okay, we are interoperable, that's fine, and now let's include others. But again, it's as he said, talked about with Evernym, it's like Evernym is a company, they kind of can implement everything, but they don't necessarily want to include and drive it forward with code. They're just like, oh, we implemented all these cool things, but in a way that we don't know if anyone else can understand. So it's they're a business driven company, and that's how it is. Yeah. And these guys are more driven by probably the bigger ecosystem.
Sovereign and Evernym are different, yeah. Like Sovereign is non-profit and Evernym is like for-profit, and the people are also different.
Sovereign is just primarily the network.
Yeah.
The DID-SOV network. And it's a non-profit, and it's just trying to drive forward an enterprise ledger, basically. Evernym is a company that does SSI. It's a consultancy company. It sells products. It sells off-the-shelf product to certain cases. It works with a lot of people in the UK. They have, of course, been tightly connected with Sovereign because they were the ones starting this whole thing a while back. But things are kind of diverging in terms of they need to. Evernym cannot control Sovereign because Sovereign is supposed to be an independent thing. But they have been highly connected, that network that came out, it's reproducible. So there's there's a lot of other networks that has this hyperledger, indie ledger in the bottom, which is basically the same as Sovereign runs. So that the DID that you kind of use uses the same ledger mechanics as did Sovereign, but has a different name, because it's basically just like you take that the Sovereign or the indie ledger node and you start it over here with a different Genesis block and a different ID. Then you kind of have a different Sovereign network. But then again, you have to make sure that people can trust your network and that it's distributed enough so people know that it won't disappear, because it's quite important. And that's what Sovereign has done in terms of their that foundation, and they have gone. It's been a while. They've been running for a while, and they've gotten good node runners and network drives, because they don't have the same as Ethereum and Bitcoin to the financial incentive necessarily. But yeah.
Thank you for today. I have another meeting. I hope for that. See you guys later.
Thanks, guys. It was great to see you show up.
Yeah, I'm also off to another appointment.
No problem. Have a good day, guys.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you for the great.
It was learning. What is it? Learning.
Grow.
Interesting. It was. Yeah.
English is struggling today. Right?
Yeah, it was difficult.
I think it was good. Yeah,
it's really important.
Like,
but yeah. You were saying something. Sorry.
That can you? What was the name of the presenter again?
Stephen Curran.
Stephen, yeah. Looks it was it really seemed that he has gone far down, like deep into the details in practical application of this, and yeah, it's very different from the more like listening to spec, like people talking about spec and things. At least that was my observation. And actually have gone and worked with government and organizations, real things.
Yeah. Next time we will actually have a guy called Manu, who works for a company who's done this for a long time, and he's also one of the builders of a lot of the standards. Who will talk about the work he's doing with government and what they're doing, because they're part of the Homeland Security grant that's gone out as well, and they're building a lot of cool stuff for the community, among others like Chappy, and which is like a web browser wallet extension. So it's interesting.